Have you ever wondered why the Romans hated the month of February so much? A month that, at first glance, may seem just another in history, but was actually filled with superstitions, dark rituals, and even physical and emotional challenges. Imagine living in a time where days were not just marked by the calendar, but laden with profound meanings and fears that influenced every decision. February was the most feared month, not just for being the shortest, but for everything it represented in the Roman Empire. Let's take a look at the 5 main reasons that made the Romans detest this month. And, more importantly, how does this relate to what we are experiencing today? Tell us in the comments, did you know that the month of February had such a historical baggage? Or did you think it was just a matter of dates? Stay with me until the end because I will show you how a simple month can change the course of an empire. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and activate the bell to stay updated on more curiosities like this. And if you've heard of any of these Roman myths, share them with us. The ancient Romans had a calendar that was profoundly different from the one we use today. Initially, the year began in March, with January and February not being part of the original calendar. This calendar, known as the Roman calendar, was created around 753 BC and consisted of 10 months. March, the month in which the year began, was associated with Mars, the god of war. Winter was not formally considered part of the year, remaining practically outside, a kind of void between the months of December and March. It was King Numa Pompilius, the successor of Romulus, who introduced the second year into the calendar by inserting January and February. However, the addition of these 2 months was not a simple exchange of dates. February, in particular, ended up being placed at the end of the year, after December. For the Romans, this change seemed more like an attempt to adjust an still imperfect calendar, but it did not hide the feeling that February was a month of transition. Therefore, not only February but also January found themselves in a position that seemed displaced, which was one of the reasons why these months were not well received. The idea that the year began in March carried a very strong symbolic weight. March was not only the month of spring but also the month in which the god Mars was celebrated. In contrast, February, being a month inserted after December, symbolized a stage of closure. For many Romans, it was as if it were a month of preparation for what was to come. All of this connected to a cycle of life and death, and February, in this case, represented the last breath of a cycle before starting again, with the arrival of spring. This aspect of February as a month that situated itself on the timeline as an end and transition set the stage for its bad reputation. It was not a month of renewing energy like the other months, with festivities or celebrations associated, but rather a month of reflection, closure, and preparation. The very fact of being outside the beginning of the calendar caused a feeling of discomfort, as if it were there just to occupy a space between other more vibrant months. This generated a sense of incompleteness, and not by chance would February end up being the exception that would break the perception of a rounded year. When the Roman calendar was finally reformed by Julius Caesar, with the introduction of the Julian calendar, February became an even more remedied month. For the Romans, numerology held significant importance in their daily lives, influencing everything from everyday practices to religious ceremonies. Among these beliefs, one of the most notable was the superstition surrounding numbers. The Romans considered odd numbers to be more favorable, representing balance and harmony, while even numbers were viewed with suspicion. The reason for this stemmed from a very peculiar symbolic view: odd numbers were indivisible, thus representing the idea of wholeness and completeness. Odd numbers were in harmony with the cosmos and life itself. On the other hand, even numbers could be divided, symbolizing something vulnerable, fragmented, and therefore prone to chaos or imbalance. This thinking was also reflected in the months of the Roman calendar. February, with its even number of days, was naturally rejected. In a cycle of life and death, where order and balance were essential for the Romans, a month with an even number of days like February seemed to carry with it a natural disharmony. Although the calendar was adjusted and February received 29 days from Julius Caesar's reforms, the fact that it was the only month with this number still placed it in an uncomfortable position. The symbolic weight of February as the flawed month made it associated with a mismatch in time. February was associated with the idea that the month was doomed to imbalance. The fact that its numerical symmetry did not correspond to the perfection of odd numbers further fueled this negative view. Moreover, the Roman superstition that the month had this code of bad luck reinforced this. This superstition was reflected not only in popular observations but also in religious practices and even in business decisions that occurred within this month, as many avoided starting new projects or making important decisions during this period. For the Romans, this sense of imperfection brought by the month of February only contributed to its image as a lesser month, a month that did not deserve to be considered on the same level as vibrant and auspicious months like March, April, or August. The presence of this superstition in Roman daily life demonstrated how a simple division of time had the power to influence feelings, choices, and even the rituals of an entire society. If the superstition surrounding numbers were not enough, the month of February also carried with it a much darker symbolic weight, that of being associated with funeral rituals and homage to the dead. The name February in Latin, Februarius, comes from februa, which referred to purification and expiation rituals. These rituals were deeply connected to the cult of the dead and the reverence for ancestors. For the Romans, this was an essential practice to maintain the balance and protection of families and the city of Rome. The connection of the month with death was evident, as February was marked by funeral ceremonies. Such ceremonies included Feralia, where homage was paid to the deceased, and Parentalia, a 9-day festival dedicated to ancestors, with offerings and prayers to ensure the peace of spirits. For the Romans, this was a period of introspection, where the living reflected on the cycle of life and death, and sought to ensure that the spirits of their deceased relatives were at peace. These ritual observances had a character of seriousness and reverence, contrasting with the festive and joyful nature of other months in the Roman calendar. February was not a month of celebration, but rather of reflection on the end of cycles, the closure of life phases, and the need for spiritual purification. This atmosphere of mourning and respect for the dead created a tense and even melancholic climate for the Romans, a month where the focus was on closing cycles. The fact that February was marked by these funeral rituals and purification ceremonies contributed to the negative view that many Romans had of this month. The dark nature of the events, combined with cultural beliefs about death, made February a period of contemplation, not of action or enthusiasm. For many, this only reinforced the idea that the month was linked to what was final, to mourning and farewell, creating an impression that February was for the month of death. February was seen as the opposite of other more dynamic periods in the Roman year, such as the beginning of spring or the celebration of gods of fertility and prosperity. In addition to funeral rituals and associations with death, February was a month of intense religious activity, but with many restrictions that made the daily life of the Romans even more challenging. During this month, the Romans followed a meticulously structured religious calendar, with specific days dedicated to certain rituals, sacrifices, and prohibitions. This not only created an environment of introspection and reverence but also imposed strict limitations on the daily activities of the population. Among these rules, the Romans observed the dies fasti and the dies nefasti, which were days when specific activities were allowed or prohibited. On dies fasti, political and judicial activities were permitted, while on dies nefasti, participation in hearings and courts was strictly forbidden, creating a paradox. This type of day heightened the sense that the month was immersed in a state of limitation and lack of progress. Furthermore, there were the dies intercisi, or half-cut days, which were divided into two parts, one reserved for religious activities and the other for other functions. However, the time available for practical actions and negotiations was reduced, generating a sense of lost productivity. This division not only limited work opportunities but also reinforced the idea that February was a month of paralysis and containment of efforts. The ritualism and religious prohibitions had a reason for being within Roman society, as they ensured that the city and its citizens followed the necessary spiritual care. This was so that the gods and the spirits of the ancestors would be pleased. However, for many Romans, especially those from lower classes or those engaged in active trade, these limitations became a burden. The religious restrictions created an environment of stagnation, where the Romans felt that the month was, in a way, shackled by norms that restricted their daily activities. These limitations, combined with the already heavy atmosphere of funeral rituals and superstitions about the month, made February perceived as the most difficult period of the year. It was not a time of freedom or progress, but of reverence, introspection, and abstinence, which increased the Romans' resistance to this month. February was also a difficult month for the Romans from an agricultural perspective. Although it marked the transition to spring, it was still immersed in the challenges of winter, a crucial period for families and farmers. During this month, the food reserves from the previous year were beginning to dwindle, while the new crops were not yet ready to be harvested. It was a time of scarcity and imminent hunger for many Roman families, especially those living in the countryside and relying on agriculture for their survival. At the beginning of February, the weather was still cold and damp, and the lands were heavy with frost and rain. For the Romans, this meant that agricultural work was arduous and uncomfortable. Tasks such as preparing the fields for planting, clearing the land, pruning trees, and managing the soil required a lot of physical effort. Additionally, burning vegetation and hoeing to renew the soil were exhausting tasks that demanded great endurance and strength. This difficult scenario was not limited to the countryside but also reflected in the city. Although Rome was a large metropolis, much of the food consumed in the city came from the interior. Scarcity in rural areas directly affected the supply to the cities, and food prices rose drastically, making the period even more challenging for poorer families. With the worsening scarcity and harsh weather conditions, February became a time of uncertainty, where many people felt the weight of the struggle for survival. Not only the scarcity of food but also the exhausting work that needed to be done on the farms made this month one of the hardest for the Romans. For those who depended on agriculture, February was not just a cold and damp month, but a time of insecurity, where the future of the crops was still uncertain. This context of constant struggle and urgent need for natural resources made February a less desirable month, creating an atmosphere of tension and anxiety among the Romans. Although it was a period of preparation for the spring harvests, it was also a time of vulnerability, where any mistake or failure in agricultural practices could mean a significant loss for the sustenance of families. One of the most important reasons for February's unpopularity among the Romans was closely linked to funeral rituals and the symbolism of mourning. The name February, in Latin, februarius, derived from februa, which referred to a type of ritual purification associated with the god Februs, a Sabine deity connected to death and purification rituals. This link to death and transition was one of the reasons why February was not a month of celebration, but rather of introspection and reverence for the dead. During this period, Rome held funeral ceremonies and religious rituals in honor of the deceased. One of the most important celebrations was Feralia, a festival dedicated to mourning and the memory of ancestors. During Feralia, Roman families offered food and prayers for the dead, seeking to ensure that the spirits of their ancestors remained at peace and protected their families from future misfortunes. Additionally, another significant ritual was Parentalia, which took place at the beginning of February, a time when Romans sought to honor the dead by making offerings at graves and temples. These rituals carried a solemn and somber atmosphere, where Romans were reminded of the inevitability of death and the importance of keeping religious traditions alive. Unlike other months of the year, which were associated with festivities, such as games and celebrations in honor of the gods, February was a time for reflection and respect for the dead, creating a striking contrast with the more festive periods of the Roman calendar. Moreover, the Roman gods themselves were strongly linked to the cycle of life and death. Februs, who lent his name to the month, was an obscure god, and the very idea of purification and renewal in the Roman calendar was intertwined with the natural cycle of life and death. This association with mortality gave February a sense of being a closed month, one that should be spent in silence and respect, rather than joy and celebration. For this reason, February became a month of withdrawal from common activities, a period where one distanced themselves from parties and fun to dedicate themselves to more serious rituals. This connection with death and funeral rites gave the month an aura of endness, making it less appreciated among Romans who preferred the more vibrant and festive months. February was also a month marked by limitations and strict religious rules, making it even less appealing to the Romans. In many ways, this month was surrounded by an atmosphere of sacredness, where even everyday activities were subordinated to religious laws. This caused discomfort among citizens who wished to enjoy their time in a more practical and productive manner, free from the constant restrictions imposed by religion. One of the main reasons why February was so problematic for the Romans was the division of the month into different types of days. There were the so-called dies fasti and dies nefasti, which referred to days that were either favorable or prohibited for civil, political, and even commercial activities, according to religious precepts. The dies fasti were days when public actions could be carried out, such as trials and political decisions. On the other hand, the dies nefasti were those on which no public activity was allowed, being exclusively dedicated to religious rituals. This made February, with its divisions of sacred and restricted days, a month with a heavier and more constrained rhythm of life. Additionally, within the month, there were the so-called dies intercalaris or intercalary days, which represented moments of the day that were entirely dedicated to sacrifice and religious worship, with a significant pause in everyday activities. This meant that during the morning and evening, the Romans needed to focus on sacred rituals, leaving only midday for other types of activities. For Romans who were accustomed to productivity and the pursuit of their daily tasks, this represented a considerable obstacle. Work or commercial activities had to be adjusted to fit this religious structure. This structuring of the month was not limited to agriculture or commerce but also affected family and personal life, as many Romans saw their plans and goals interrupted by these religious interventions. Since February was a month that already carried the symbolism of transition and closure, the additional time limitations imposed a sense of confinement and monotony, far removed from the continuous movement of other months that were more liberated from restrictions. Therefore, this aspect of February further reinforced the perception that the month was not only dark and closed but also difficult to deal with, given the excessive number of rules and interruptions to normal life. This religious organization manifested itself as a stark contrast to the months when the Romans could fully enjoy their festivities, markets, and celebrations. In February, the Roman people found themselves once again in a state of limitation and respect for divine forces. Although February marks the transition to spring, it also represented a challenging period in the Roman agricultural calendar. In many ways, this month served as a bridge between the harsh winter and the beginning of the harvest season, but for Romans who relied on agriculture, it brought more difficulties than benefits. During this time, Roman families began to face the typical hardships of late winter. The food reserves from the previous harvest were nearly depleted, while the new crops were still far off. This gap in food supply created a sense of scarcity, causing great discomfort among the population. The Romans had to do everything possible to ensure that food resources lasted until the start of the spring harvests, which was not always feasible. Moreover, this transitional period between seasons also required a series of preparations for the new agricultural cycle, such as clearing the fields, pruning fruit trees, and cultivating the land for the next crop. These tasks were physically exhausting and consumed a lot of time and energy, all under a cold and damp climate that made working in the fields even more challenging. Roman farmers, as Varro and Columella reported, viewed the work of February as essential but extremely arduous. The biting cold made outdoor activities difficult, and tasks such as weeding, planting seeds, and caring for the soil required intense physical strength. The physical discomfort, combined with the pressure to ensure the next agricultural cycle was successful, made February a month in which Romans felt far more difficulties than rewards. As much as February was the month when preparations for the harvest began, this time was marked by a sense of uncertainty. The scarcity of food and the need to work the fields under adverse weather made this month one of the toughest parts of the year for Romans. For many, it was a phase of penury, a month of physical and emotional hardships, reinforcing the negative image associated with February. The month of preparation was a time of anxiety about the future, as it brought the promise of a new season, while the intense work and uncertainties about the harvest turned the month into a true challenge. Thus, February, although hopeful in its transition to spring, was also a month that forced Romans to confront the weight of past difficulties and the pressure of future responsibilities. This added another layer to the already complex negative reputation of this month. Now that we have unraveled the mysteries behind the month of February and everything it represented for the Romans, it is clear that it was not just an ordinary month. On the contrary, it was a period laden with superstitions, rituals, and challenges that even affected the very rhythm of Roman society. From the dark origins of the month, through the macabre festivities, to the adjustments made to please selfish emperors, February truly stood out as the most feared and disadvantaged month in the Roman calendar. But what's most interesting is how these same superstitions and challenges can make us reflect on today's days. If you have ever imagined that a simple date on the calendar could have such an impact, why not stop to think about what really shapes our perception of time and how it affects our personal lives? Now, how about diving deeper into more stories like this? Want to know which other month the Romans really hated, or discover lost secrets and myths of the Roman Empire? Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there's much more coming your way. Comment here, which of these reasons do you think would be the hardest to bear? What do you think the Roman calendar can teach us about modern times? And before you go, you already know, stay tuned, because our next story will leave you speechless. Did the Romans really believe that the power of a number could change the fate of an entire empire? Only time will tell. Next, we will explore how a simple number caused a great impact on the Roman Empire. You won't want to miss this story. So, subscribe and hit the bell. Until the next video,